Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to my virtual University of Utah UROP program final presentation. My name is Alan Chavez. I am a senior student in music here, and I have had the opportunity during the past year to work for the University of Utah School of Music History project, whom I collaborated with for my project. I went through University of Utah Daily Utah Chronicle articles through the online archives, and I sourced information from there about faculty and students in the music department, different musical events, and performers who came through. And one thing that I found was the Masterminds and Artists series. I've subtitled this Visiting Influencers in the Pre-Civil Rights Era. And I did so because I want today to take a look at this series in particular and see how it might evidence that the people that came through may have contributed to the University of Utah's forward-thinking attitudes of the time and their desire for not only great performances and great lectures, but also for racial equality throughout the state of Utah and within the University of Utah. So I guess the first question is, what exactly was the Masterminds and Artists series? Well, it was a long-standing series run by the University of Utah's Extension Division, which is now the Division of Continuing Education. It was founded in 1918 by Frederick William Reynolds, then head of the Extension Division, and it invited nationally renowned lecturers, performers, musicians, and thinkers of many disciplines. Both students and citizens of Salt Lake City were encouraged to attend, and it was intended to refine the culture of Salt Lake City, hence why both citizens and students were invited to come. This wasn't just, exclusive to the students. It was eventually rebranded as Lectures and Artists in 1953, and then the University Artists in 1959. And eventually, due to a lack of student interest, it was split into the Civic Music Series for musical events and ASUU Artists and Speakers Committee. For the purposes of my research and for this presentation, we will focus on the performances and set the lectures aside for the time being. In the categories of guests, well, who is a mastermind? Between 1938 to 48, which is kind of the pre-civil rights era I've looked at here, the masterminds included noted lecturers, faculty, and leaders from other universities and states. And I should have added governments as well. There were some international members who came from Spain and Japan. There were New York Metropolitan Opera Company singers in famous American and international ensembles. There were radio commentators and world travelers and photographers. So, looking into the musicians who came through, these are a list of some of them who came through, and within this we have a lot of variety. The most part are classically trained vocalists, like Igor Gorin there at the top, but we also had some interesting ones like Benno Rabinoff and Romney Miller, who were a violinist and a cellist, respectively. We had Anne Brown, who was a woman of color and actually played an important role in Porgy and Bess. And an interesting one that I want to pull through is Grant Johannesson, who was a University of Utah alumni who actually had a very successful career playing piano. Musical organizations that came through included the Don Cossack Chorus, which was a chorus of exiled Russian Cossacks. And then you can see these other groups here. I want to pay attention to the Evagesi Choir in particular. Evagesi played an important part in the progress of civil rights and the works of black people here in America. And the Metropolitan Opera Company vocalists included multiple names. Jan Pierce was perhaps the most popular one, and Marian Anderson is perhaps the one of most importance to my presentation. She was the first black soprano to sing with the Met Opera, and she has an important story that will tie into this narrative that I'm presenting to you. But before we get to that, I do want to include the other performing arts as well. There were character sketches, kind of a lost art in today's world. The most interesting one here is Henry L. Scott, who was a pianist, a character sketch artist. So on top of giving performances of real numbers, he'd also do funny character sketches while doing that. And there were multiple dance troupes that came through. The Hanya Holm dancers in particular were important. Hanya Holm is considered one of the big four of American dance. And while I don't really have time to go over these things in detail, I will encourage you to contact me privately If you want to learn a little bit more about this, I can link you to any articles that I find regarding this, and we can talk about it. But moving on here, this is what I would see when I was doing my work. So this is Grant Johannessen's announcement for his performance. I would go through and find out who was involved, what time it was, what organizations were involved, and then if there were any additional notes, I would record them all on a spreadsheet so that we can build timelines and construct our narratives off of this for the University of Utah's faculty and events. Grant Johannessen there looks very pleased to be performing. It's always a pleasant surprise when there's a picture in good quality of whoever performed or of a faculty member, because as you can see for Huddy Ledbetter's here, there were not a lot of pictures that were preserved within these newspapers. Leadbelly himself has a lot of information, which unfortunately I had to crop to fit on this page. And there we have Romnea Miller, who was a cellist and not a vocalist who came through. And this has some information on her program and on a little bit of background for both me doing my research in the present and the interested reader back there in 1948. And then a lovely presentation of a character sketch here. You'd think that with all of them there'd be more pictures, but this is the only one that I could find, and it is a pleasant surprise to get a glimpse into what this character sketch might have been like. So my presentation wants to focus on the questions of today that might have been asked yesterday. This was a narrative and a question that I found asked and answered during this time of, before we had the civil rights movement in the 60s, and partially before we even had the Second World War. So issues of race were something that the Utes were aware of. They weren't naive to the fact that there was that discrimination and racism going on throughout the U.S. Marian Anderson's story shows an interesting trend in the idea of civil rights in Utah. And a little bit of a side note here on John Roy Carlson's, but he talked a little bit more on fascism and how it is ignorance in action, and specifically categorized those dangerous movements, nationalism, America First, and Peace Now, and feared that fascist leaders would get into power through so-called respectable channels, meaning that they'd get a degree of legitimacy that they don't really deserve. And I don't want to spend too long here, but this idea of fascism will come back at the end of this lecture. So I just wanted to introduce that. This was another thing that the U.S. and the Utes were concerned about. So performers of color that came through, we have Eva Jesse, who promoted the music of the U.S. in her lecture and was recognized for her role in Porgy and Bess. She also played a huge part in the Harlem Renaissance and was a very noted performer of color. Anne Brown created the role of Bess in Porgy and Bess, and Marian Anderson, as I mentioned earlier, was the first black soprano to sing with the New York Met Opera. And Huddy Ledbetter was a famous folk singer who came through and played a 12-string guitar. As for not performers, but people who spoke on civil rights, we had Elaine Leroy Rock, a black philosopher who was considered the father of the Harlem Renaissance. He spoke on racial equality and how the Western world must abdicate its attitudes of snobism and cultural superiority. He urges the Utes to not look down upon people who want to be a part of the U.S. culture, because people of color know that there's a lot of good in America and they want to be a part of it, so why exclude them from that if they're going to contribute? Ellis Arnall was a white man, but he was governor of Georgia and spoke on the need for blacks' right to vote. In addition, he advocated the need for an educated citizenry. And while his whole address wasn't preserved, the subtext within that article hinted to the fact that he may have been urging us to educate both, citizens of any status and color, so that they can contribute to our nation and not just be, used by those in power. And coming back to Marian Anderson, this is a story from the Civil Rights Movement in Utah, a blog post that was penned by Thomas G. Alexander. And reading it to you, Salt Lake City hotels refused accommodations to Metropolitan Opera contralto Marian Anderson in 1937. In 1938, the Hotel Utah rented her a room only after she agreed to ride up the freight elevator. In 1948 and 1951, conditions had changed so much that when Anderson returned, the Hotel Utah accommodated her without question. Moreover, she sang to a standing room-only audience at the LDS Salt Lake Tabernacle in 1948. And that performance in the Salt Lake Tabernacle was a Masterminds and Artists performance. You can see right there in the first paragraph, Marian Anderson will be heard in a concert on March 19th at the Salt Lake Tabernacle as a part of the 1948 Masterminds and Artists series. And I love the language of this article, showing that it's just unabashed, love and appreciation for Miss Anderson's performing prowess and her musicianship. And I think the standing room only concert attests to how well received she was by both students and citizenry that came and supported her and heard her sing. And this is in an age where, and even now, there isn't as much racial progressiveness as we might hope in some parts of our nation. So this is very heartwarming and very encouraging to see that this culture of inclusivity and non-discrimination was already being fostered here in the 40s. And as to the student opinion, up to now I've kind of presented, performers' perspectives and different lectures given by these different people. But the students themselves did show that they were aware of this, and they did care about the fact that there was racism in our state, in our university perhaps. And reading from the second paragraph, this article says, last week a group of interested university students performed a social experiment on racial discrimination in Salt Lake City restaurants and theaters. That's Salt Lake City, remember, not Charleston, Atlanta, Jackson, or Natchez. What they discovered might surprise you. In only one theater tested were the colored people allowed to sit downstairs. Most of the restaurants refused service to the group. One, which generally refuses service, admitted the mixed group. Maybe you think this doesn't matter, since you are free, white, and able to enter any theater or restaurant in town, it probably does not concern you. But did you ever stop to think how ridiculous a color line looks in Salt Lake City? Out here we have grown from a sagebrush democracy to a thriving empire. As we recall, this territory was settled by a people who had been kicked around a great deal and pushed from place to place and laughed at and snubbed and tagged as a peculiar people. And this is wonderfully observant and wonderfully forward-thinking. Obviously, it is hypocritical and, frankly, sad if we, a people who live in a city founded by a religious group who was thrust out for unfair reasons and persecuted, turn around and do that to another, marginalized group within our own city. And another student opinion article penned by Gordon Hyde, a student and member of Delta Phi, he says, in the second time in 25 years, we have saved the world for democracy. We have defeated fascism. We have freed a slave Europe and put down Axis tyranny. So is it any wonder, then, that we are surprised and piqued when the liberated show no desire for this democracy we bring them? And another note here, we have advertised America as the nation where all men have equal rights and opportunity, but like a lot of American advertising, it doesn't state the full facts. What we should say is America is the land of equal rights for all citizens who can qualify with the correct skin color. Very aware of the double standard that we hold here, and that we held here, I should say, in America more so in that time. And there's a picture of that article that I'm sourcing this from. There's good old Gordon himself. And to continue on with the quotes, we have the power to correct this fascist practice, meaning discrimination, in our own state. A bill making discrimination unlawful was presented at the last legislature and defeated by some of the very people that cry the loudest that the Constitution is being subverted. The bill will be presented again to give equal privileges to all Utah. It will be defeated again unless we support it and insist that our representatives do also. Watch for this bill and mark down the names of those who vote against it as men unfit to represent a free people. Most European nations draw no color line. Only in the fascist countries did race become the monster that it has been in America. We will never assume the leadership in the world that we could, as long as we refuse to accept men of all colors as our equals. And this is a wonderful finding. While it might be a stretch to infer that because of the Mastermind series, the student body became aware of, the racial disharmony that was present within our own city. But I can say that these things probably did contribute to each other. I mean, a highly racist city would not give a standing room only performance would not be conducive to a standing room only performance. And I'm glad to say that it seems that our tradition of trying to accept others as equals and promote, no discrimination is a long-held practice here at the University of Utah that extends all the way back to 1946 here. And so this has been my presentation. I'm glad that I was able to share this with you, and here's to moving forward and developing this great democracy that we do have within our nation. I'm thankful for all of you who spent time listening to me, and I'm signing off here.